Dragons of the Hourglass Mage. Forward. This book, Dragons of the Hourglass Mage, concludes the Lost Chronicles series. Our goal in these books has been to tell the previously untold and unknown stories of the Innfellows during the War of the Lance, a period covered by the Dragonlance Chronicles. Although these books can be read on their own, readers will find that they will have a far more complete idea and understanding of what is happening to whom and where, and why it is happening, if they read the complete series of Dragonlance Chronicles before reading the Lost Chronicles. The end of the War of the Lance was chronicled by Astinus of Palanthas in a volume that came to be known as Dragons of Spring Dawning. In that book, we follow the adventures of the heroes of the Lance, Tanis Half-Elven, Flint Fireforge, Tasselhoff Barefoot, Raistlin Majere, and their friends Lorna the Golden General, Tika Whalen, Riverwind, and Gold Moon, and we recount how they finally defeat the Queen of Darkness. This book deals with one of the heroes of the Lance, Raistlin Majere, whose story was never told, but without whom the other heroes could never have succeeded. If you would like to follow the complete tale, Astinus suggests that you read Dragons of Spring Dawning first, then read this book after. If you would just like to share Raistlin's dark and perilous adventures, then simply keep on reading. At the time this book begins, the heroes of the Lance have been separated by the war. Tanis, Caramon, and Raistlin, and Tika, Riverwind, and Goldmoon travel to the nightmare land of Sylvanesti, and from there to Flotsam. Lorna, Sturm, Brightblade, Flint, and Tasselhoff travel to Icewall, and from there to the High Clerist's Tower, where Sturm sacrifices his life for the cause of light. Lorna helps defeat Kitiara and her dragon army at the Battle of the High Clerist Tower. She, Flint, and Tas travel to Palanthas, where Lorna is made the Golden General, in charge of the human and elf forces now battling Takhisis. Once in Flotsam, Tanis meets his former lover Kitiara and is shocked to discover that she is now a dragon high lord in Takhisis' evil army. But though she is on the side of evil, he cannot resist her dark eyes and crooked smile. The two again become lovers. Kitiara urges Tanis to join her army. He cannot abandon his friends and the cause of light. Torn by guilt, he leaves Kit and joins his friends on a ship fleeing Flotsam. On board the ship is also Berem Everman, sought by the Queen of Darkness. Hearing the Everman is on this ship, Kitiara flies her dragon in pursuit. Desperate to escape, Berem steers the ship into a maelstrom. Raistlin Majere believes the ship is doomed, and he uses the magical dragon orb he obtained in Sylvanesti to save himself, leaving his twin brother and friends to die. His magic carries him to the great library of Palanthas. The spellcasting proves too much for him. He is on the verge of death when Astinus accidentally provides Raistlin with a key that will not only restore him to life, but unlock the mystery of his divided soul. Raistlin arrives in Palanthas on the 26th day of the month of Ranmont. We take up his story several days later, on the first day of the month of Mishamont. Astinus, chronicler of the history of Kryn, writes, on the 26th day of the month of Mishamont, year 352 AC, in the city of Neraka, the temple of Takhisis falls. The Dragon Queen is banished from the world. Her armies go down to defeat. Much of the credit for this victory is given to the heroes of the lance, who fought valiantly for the forces of light. History should note, however, that the light would have been doomed to failure if not for one man who chose to walk in darkness. Prologue. 2 legends of Krynn are essential to the understanding of the plot. Many variations of these legends can be found. Every bard tells them somewhat differently. We have chosen these versions as being the closest to what actually occurred, though, as with most legends, the truth of the matter will likely never be known. Excerpts from A Child's Garden of Tales of Krynn, translated from the Elvish by Quivalin Soth. The Story of Berem and Jasla, a tale of love and sacrifice long ago, at the end of the Second Dragon War. The valiant knight Huma Dragon's Bane drove Queen Takhisis into the abyss. He forced her to swear an oath before the High God that she would not return to the world to upset the delicate balance between good and evil. The gods believed that an oath taken before the High God was so powerful that not even the Queen of Darkness would dare break it. Sadly, they were mistaken. Time passed. The king-priests of Ishtar, acting in the name of the gods of light and with their blessing, rose in power. The world was at peace. Unfortunately, a man may be blinded by light as well as by darkness. The last king-priest looked into the sun and saw nothing but his own glory, and dared to proclaim himself a god. The gods of light realized to their sorrow that they were now threatening the balance that causes the world to keep turning. They sought the help of the other gods, including Queen Takhisis. The gods determined that in order to restore the balance and teach mankind humility, they would cause a great cataclysm. Before they acted, they sent the king-priest many warnings, urging him to change. The king-priest and his followers turned a deaf ear, and the gods, greatly grieving, hurled a fiery mountain down upon Krynn. The blast leveled the city of Ishtar and cast it into the sea and destroyed the temple of the gods of light. Or so the gods believed. But although the temple of Ishtar lay in ruins at the bottom of the sea, the foundation stone upon which the temple was built remained intact. For that stone is the foundation of faith. After the cataclysm, the gods hoped men would acknowledge their faults and seek out the gods. To the gods' sorrow, men blamed the gods for their suffering. Word spread that the gods had abandoned their creation. The world erupted into chaos. Death stalked the land. Takhisis, Queen of Darkness, was still imprisoned in the abyss. All the exits were guarded. If she tried to break free, the other gods would know, and they would stop her. Still, she never quit seeking a way back into the world, and one day, in her restless roaming, she came upon a great prize. Takhisis discovered the foundation stone. The other gods did not know it still existed. She realized that she could use the stone to return to the world. True, she would be breaking her oath to the High God, but she was cunning, and she counted upon the fact that the world was already in peril. Men had lost hope. Plagues, pestilence, famines, and wars had killed millions. Takhisis could enter the world and wake her evil dragons and launch her war. When she conquered Krynn, she would be so powerful that the other gods would not dare to punish her. Takhisis, cloaked in darkness, slipped into the world through the gate left open by the foundation stone. She woke her evil dragons and ordered them to steal the eggs of the good dragons, who slumbered in their lairs. She prepared to prosecute her war with all her might and power. Then she discovered one day that her way into the world through the foundation stone had been blocked. A man named Berem and his sister Jasla were walking together when they came upon the foundation stone. They could not believe their good fortune. Rare and precious gems embedded in the stone sparkled and shone in the light of creation. Berem was a poor man. One gem could relieve his family's poverty. One gem, one perfect emerald, out of so many would not be missed. Berem began to pry the emerald loose. His sister Jasla was horrified by the theft. She grabbed hold of her brother to try to stop him. Berem flew into a rage and flung her away. She fell and struck her head on the stone and died, her blood staining the foundation stone. Berem loved his sister, and he was appalled at his crime, and he was afraid. No one would believe him when he said that killing his sister had been an accident. He would be executed for murder. Instead of confessing his sin and seeking forgiveness, he turned to flee. As he did so, the emerald that he had been trying to steal sprang from the foundation stone and embedded itself into his chest. Berem was frantic with terror. The spirit of his sister grieved for him. She assured him she still loved him, but he refused to listen. He tried to tear the gem out with his fingers. He was so desperate, he sought to cut it out of his own flesh with a knife. The emerald remained a part of him, the everlasting reminder of his guilt. Berem covered up the gem with his shirt and fled, closing his ears to the pleas of his sister to seek forgiveness, even as she had forgiven him. Takhisis had been witness to this tragedy and had revelled in Berem's downfall, until she tried to cross the foundation stone. She found her entrance barred by a chain forged of love. Jasla's spirit blocked her way. Now only the Dark Queen's shadow could be cast over Kryn. Her power over man was reduced. She would have to rely on mortals to prosecute her war. Takhisis had to find Berem. If she could destroy him, his sister's spirit would depart, and the Queen would once more be free. She had to be careful in her search for him, however, for if he returned to his sister and redeemed himself, her entry into the world would be blocked for good. She sent secret word out to her most trusted servants to seek a man named Berem, who had a green gemstone embedded in his chest. A man with an old face and young eyes, for the gem gave him immortality. He could not die until he was either redeemed or his soul was utterly lost. Berem was always on the move, running not only from the forces of darkness, but also from his own guilt. Time and again, Takhisis was thwarted in her efforts to capture him. She launched her war, which became known as the War of the Lance, and still Berem had not been found. But by now, his tale was becoming known to more and more people, and eventually was bound to come to the attention of those fighting Queen Takhisis. Berem Everman would become men's greatest hope and their greatest fear. The Story of Fistandantilus. A cautionary tale. Long ago, there lived a powerful wizard named Fistandantilus. He was so powerful that he came to believe that the rules and laws which governed other, lesser men did not apply to him. These included those laws of his own order of magic, that of the Black Robes. Fistandantilus left the order and became a renegade, subject to death at the hands of his fellow wizards. Fistandantilus did not fear his fellow wizards. He had amassed such knowledge and skill in magic that he could destroy any who came to try to bring him to justice. Such was the fear and respect in which his fellow wizards held him that few tried. Fistandantilus flaunted his power in the face of the conclave, even taking on apprentices. What no one knew was that he was feeding off his pupils, sucking out their life forces and using that to extend his own. He had created a magical gem, a bloodstone, for this purpose. He would press the stone to the heart of his victim and drain him of life. As Fistandantilus's power grew, so did his arrogance. He decided to enter the abyss and overthrow the Queen of Darkness and take her place. To this end, he crafted one of the most powerful and complex magical spells ever created. His arrogance proved his downfall. No one is certain what happened. Some say Takhisis found out, and her wrath brought down his fortress on top of him. Others say that his spell escaped his control and blew the fortress apart. Whatever the cause, Fistandantilus's mortal body died. His soul, however, did not. His soul refused to leave Kryn, and the evil wizard remained on the ethereal plane. His existence was tenuous, for he was constantly under siege from Takhisis, who continued to try to destroy him. He kept himself alive by leeching off the life forces of his victims, even as he hoped someday to find a living body he could inhabit and return to life. Fistandantilus had managed to retain his bloodstone, and, armed with that, he lay in wait for victims. He sought out young magic users, particularly those who were leaning toward darkness, for they would be most likely to succumb to temptation. The conclave of wizards knew Fistandantilus was searching for prey, but they were powerless to stop him. Whenever a young magic user took the dread test in the Tower of High Sorcery, the conclave knew there was a chance that Fistandantilus would seize him. Many who died taking the test were thought to have been his victims. 5 years prior to the start of the War of the Lance, a young mage and his twin brother came to the Tower of Weirith to take the test. The young man had shown great promise in his studies. Foreseeing a time of war and evil coming to Kryn, the head of the conclave, Salian, hoped that this young mage would assist in defeating the darkness. The young mage was himself arrogant and ambitious. Although he wore the red robes, his heart and soul tended toward darkness, and his own choices led him to strike a bargain with Fistandantilus. The evil wizard did not intend to keep his side of the deal. He meant to drain the young man of his life. Raistlin Majere was not like others before him. He was in his own way as skilled in magic as Fistandantilus. When the evil mage came to seize a young man's heart and rip it from his body, Raistlin grasped hold of the heart of Fistandantilus. "You may take my life," Raistlin told Fistandantilus, "but you will serve me in return." The young man survived his test, but he was shattered in body, for Fistandantilus was continually draining him of life in order to sustain himself on his magical plane. In return, however, Fistandantilus had to keep Raistlin alive, and would come to his aid by feeding him knowledge of magics that were far advanced for such a young wizard. Raistlin did not remember any of his test, nor did he remember his bargain. He thought the test had ruined his health, and Pa Salin did not tell him otherwise. He will know the truth only when he comes to know the truth about himself. Confront and admit the darkness within. Pa Salin spoke those words, but not even he in his wisdom could foresee how the dark and strange alliance would, in the end, be resolved. The story can be found in The Soul Forge by Margaret Weis, published by Wizards of the Coast. Book 1. A Roll of the Die, An Unexpected Encounter, 2nd day, month of Mishamont, year 352 AC. The city of Palanthas had been awake most of the night, bracing for war. The city had not panicked. Ancient aristocratic grand dames such as Palanthas never panicked. They sat rigid in their ornately carved chairs, holding tight to their lace handkerchiefs and waiting with stern countenances and straight backs for someone to tell them if there was going to be a war, and, if so, would it be so rude as to interrupt their plans for dinner? The forces of the feared Blue Lady, Dragon High Lord Kitiara, were rumored to be marching on the city. The High Lord's armies had been defeated at the High Clerist's Tower, which guarded the pass leading down from the mountains and into Palanthas. The small group of knights and foot soldiers who had held the tower against the initial assault were not strong enough to hold out against another attack. They had left the fortress and the graves of their dead, retreating to Palanthas. The city had not been pleased at that. If the militant, war-mongering knights had not entered her walls, Palanthas would have been left in peace. The dragon armies would not dare to attack a city so venerable and revered. The wise knew better. Almost all other major cities in Krynn had fallen to the might of the dragon armies. The baleful eyes of Emperor Auricus were turned to Palanthas, to her port, her ships, her wealth. The glittering city, the jewel of Solamnia, would be the most magnificent gem in Auricus's crown of power. The Lord of Palanthas sent his troops to the battlements. The citizens hunkered down in their houses, shuttered their windows. Shops and businesses closed. The city believed she was prepared for the worst, and if the worst came, as it had come to other cities, such as Solis and Tarsus, Palanthas would fight valiantly. For there was courage in the heart of the old grand dame. Her rigid spine was made of steel. She was not tested. The worst did not come. The forces of the Blue Lady had been routed at the High Clerist's Tower and were in retreat. The dragons sighted that morning, winging toward the city's walls, were not the red fire-breathing dragons, or the lightning-crackling blue dragons people feared. The morning sun sparkled on the shining silver scales. Silver dragons had flown from their homes in the Dragon Isles to defend Palanthas, or so the dragons claimed. Since war did not come, the citizens of Palanthas left their homes and opened their shops and surged out into the streets talking, arguing. The Lord of Palanthas assured the citizens that the new dragons were on the side of light, that they worshipped Paladine and Meshakel and the rest of the gods of light, that they had agreed to assist the Knights of Solamnia, protectors of the city. Some people believed their lord, some didn't. Some argued that dragons of any color were not to be trusted, that they were simply to lull the people into a state of complacency, and that the dragons would attack in the dead of night, and they would all be devoured in their beds. Fools, Raistlin muttered more than once as he shoved his way through the crowds, or rather as he was bumped and jostled and nearly run over by a careening horse cart. If he had been wearing his red robes, that marked him as a wizard. The people of Palanthas would have eyed him askance, left him severely alone, gone out of their way to avoid him. Clad in the plain grey robes of an ascetic of the great library of Palanthas, Raistlin was trampled and pushed and trod upon. Palanthians were not fond of wizards, even those of the red robes, who were neutral in the war, or the white, who were dedicated to the side of light. Both orders of high sorcery had worked and sacrificed to bring about the return of the metallic dragons to Ansalon. The head of their order, Parsalian, knew that the sight of the spring dawn glistening on silver and golden wings would come as a punch in the gut to Emperor Ariacus, the first blow that had been able to penetrate his dragon-scale armor. All during the war, the wings of Takisi's evil dragons had darkened the skies. Now the skies of Krynn shone with brightening light, and the Emperor and his queen were starting to grow nervous. The people of Palanthas did not know that the wizards had been working to protect them, and would not have believed such a claim if they heard it. To their minds, the only good wizard was a wizard who lived somewhere besides Palanthas. Raistlin Majere was not wearing his red robes because they were wrapped in a bundle tucked under his arm. He wore the borrowed grey robes of one of the monks of the great library. Borrowed. Thinking of that word brought to mind Tasselhoff Barefoot. The light-hearted and lighter-fingered Kender never stole anything. When caught with purloined goods upon his person, the Kender would claim to have borrowed. The sugar basin, stumbled across, the silver candlesticks, was just coming to return. The emerald necklace. Raistlin had stumbled upon the aesthetic's robes lying folded neatly on a bed that morning. He had every intention of returning the grey robes in a day or two. Mostly people, absorbed in their arguments, ignored him as he fought his way through the crowded streets, but occasionally some citizen would stop him to ask what Astinus thought about the arrival of the metallic dragons, the dragons of light. Raistlin didn't know what Astinus thought, and he didn't care, keeping his cowl pulled low to conceal the fact that his skin shimmered gold in the sunlight, and that the pupils of his eyes were the shape of hourglasses. He would mutter an excuse and hurry on. He hoped sourly that the workers at his destination were actually doing some work, that they were not out gossiping in the street. He regretted thinking of Tasselhoff. The memory of the Kender brought back memories of his friends and his brother. He should say his deceased friends, deceased brother. Tanis Halfhelven, Tika, Riverwind and Goldmoon, and Caramon, all of them dead. He alone had survived, and that was because he had been smart enough to have foreseen disaster and planned a way out. He had to face the fact that Caramon and the others were dead, and quit obsessing over it. But even as he told himself he should stop thinking about them, he thought about them. Fleeing the dragon armies in Flotsam, he and his brother and their friends had sought to escape by taking passage aboard a pirate ship, the Parachon. They had been pursued by a dragon high lord, his half-sister, Kitiara, as it turned out. The crazed helmsman had steered the ship deliberately into the Blood Sea's feared maelstrom. The ship had been ripped apart, spars falling, sails being torn to tatters. The wild water was breaking over the decks. Raistlin had a choice. Either he could die with the rest of them, or he could leave. The choice was obvious to anyone with a brain, which excluded his brother. Raistlin had in his possession the magical dragon orb that had once belonged to the ill-fated King Lorak. Raistlin had used the magic of the orb to escape. True, he might have taken his friends with him. He might have saved all of them. He might at least have saved his brother. But Raistlin was only just learning about the powers of the dragon orb. He was not certain the orb had the ability to save the rest, and therefore he had saved himself and the other who was always with him, who was with him even as he pushed his way through the streets of Palanthas. Once this other had been a whispered voice in Raistlin's head, unknown and mysterious and maddening. But the mystery had been solved. Raistlin could put a hideous face to the disembodied voice, give the speaker a name. "Your decision was logical, young Magus," Fistandantilus said, adding with a sneer, "Your twin is dead. Good riddance. Caramon weakened you, diminished you. Now that you are free of him, you will go far. I will see to that." "You won't see to anything," Raistlin retorted. "I beg your pardon," said a passer-by, halting. "Were you speaking to me, sir?" Raistlin muttered something, and, ignoring the man's offended stare, kept on walking. He had been forced to listen to the yammering voice all morning. He had even fancied he could see the black-robed, soul-sucking spectre of the Archmage dogging his footsteps. Raistlin wondered bitterly if the bargain he had made with the evil wizard had been worth it. "Without me, you would have died taking the test in the tower at Weyrith," said Fistandantilus. "You came out of our deal well enough. A bit of your life in exchange for my knowledge and power." Raistlin had not been afraid he would die. He had been afraid he would fail. That was the true reason he had made the bargain with the old man. Raistlin could not have borne failure. He could not have endured his brother's pity or the fact that he would have been dependent on his stronger twin for the rest of his days. Just thinking about the undead leech of a wizard sucking the life out of him as one sucks the juice from a peach brought on a coughing fit. Raistlin had always been frail and sickly, but the bargain he had struck with Fistandantilus, which allowed the spirit of the Archmagus to remain alive on his dark plane of tortured existence, in return for Raistlin's escape, had exacted its toll. His lungs seemed to be always filled with wool. He felt as though he were being smothered. He was subject to fits of coughing that almost doubled him over, as happened at that moment. He had to pause and lean against a building for support, wiping the blood from his lips with a grey sleeve of the purloined robe. He felt weaker than usual. Using the magic of the dragon orb to transport him across a continent had taken far more out of him than he had anticipated. He had been half dead when he had arrived in Palanthas 4 days earlier, so weak that he had collapsed on the steps of the great library. The monks had taken pity on him and carried him inside. He was recovered somewhat, but he was still not well. He would not be well ever, not until he ended his bargain. Fistandantilus seemed to think that Raistlin's soul was to be his reward. The Archmage was going to be disappointed. Since Raistlin's soul was finally his own, he was not going to meekly hand it over to Fistandantilus. Raistlin considered that the Archmage had done well out of the deal he'd made with Raistlin in the tower. Fistandantilus was, after all, leeching part of Raistlin's life force in order to cling to his miserable existence. But as far as Raistlin was concerned, the two of them were even. It was time to end their bargain. Except Raistlin couldn't figure out how to do that without Fistandantilus knowing about it and stopping him. The old man was constantly lurking about, eavesdropping on Raistlin's thoughts. There had to be a way to shut the door and lock the windows of his mind. Raistlin finally recovered enough to be able to resume his errand. He continued through the streets, following directions that were given to him by people he met along the way, and soon left the central part of Old City behind, and, with it, the crowds. He entered the working part of the city, where streets were known by their trade. He passed Ironmonger's Avenue and Butcher's Row and the Horse Fair and Goldsmith Lane on his way to the street where wool merchants plied their trade. He was searching for a particular business when he glanced down an alleyway and saw a sign marked with the symbols of 3 moons, a red moon, a silver, and a black. It was a mageware shop. The shop was small, a mere hole in the wall. Raistlin was surprised to find such a shop at all, surprised that someone had even bothered to open a shop dealing in objects related to the use of magic in a city that despised those who wielded magic. He knew of only one wizard who resided in the city, and that was Justarius, head of Raistlin's own order, the Red Robes. Raistlin supposed there must be others. He'd never given the matter much thought. His steps slowed. The mageware shop would have what he sought. It would be costly. He could not afford it. He had only a small sum of steel, hoarded up and hidden away over months. He had to save his steel for lodging and food in Neraka, his destination, once his health was restored and his business in Palanthas was finished. Besides, the owner of the mageware shop would be bound to report Raistlin's purchase to the Conclave, the body of wizards that enforced the laws of magic. The Conclave could not stop him, but he would be summoned to Weis and called upon to explain himself. Raistlin didn't have time for all that. Events were happening, momentous, world-shaking events. The end was coming. The Dark Queen would soon be celebrating her victory. Raistlin did not plan to be standing on the street corner cheering as she rode past in triumph. He planned to be leading the parade. Raistlin walked past the mageware shop and came at last to the place he'd been seeking. The stench alone should have guided him, he thought, covering his nose and mouth with his sleeve. The business was located in a large open-air yard filled with stacks of wood to stoke the fires. Smoke mingled with steam rising from the huge kettles and vats, and reeked with the odors of the various ingredients used in the process, some of which were not at all pleasant. Clutching his bundle, Raistlin entered a small building located near the compound, where men and women were howling wood and stirring the contents of the vats with big wooden paddles. A clerk on a stool was writing figures in a large book. Another man sat on another stool, studying long lists. Neither took any notice of Raistlin. Raistlin waited a moment. Then he coughed, causing the man looking over the lists to raise his eyes. Seeing Raistlin waiting in the entrance, the man left his stool and came over to inquire how he might serve one of the honored aesthetics. "I have some cloth to be dyed," said Raistlin, and he brought forth the red robes. He kept his hood over his face, but he could not very well hide his hands. Fortunately, the building was shadowy, and Raistlin hoped the man would not notice his gold-colored skin. The dyer examined the color, running his hands over the cloth. "A nice wool," he pronounced. "Not fine, mind you, but good and serviceable. It should take the dye well. What color would you like, revered sir?" Raistlin was about to reply when he was interrupted by a fit of coughing so severe that he staggered and fell back against the doorframe. He missed his brother's strong arm, which had always been there to support him. The dyer eyed Raistlin and backed up slightly in alarm. "Not catching, is it, sir?" "Black," Raistlin gasped, ignoring the question. "I'm sorry, what did you say?" asked the dyer. "It's hard to hear with all that jabbering." He gestured to the compound behind him, where women engaged in dunking the cloth in the kettles were yelling back and forth or exchanging barbed comments with men who stoked the fires. "Black," Raistlin said, raising his voice. He generally spoke softly. Talking irritated his throat. The dyer raised an eyebrow. Aesthetics who served Astinus in the great library wore robes of grey. "It is not for me," Raistlin added. "I'm acting for a friend." "Oh, I see," said the dyer. He cast Raistlin a quizzical glance, which Raistlin, overtaken by another fit of coughing, did not notice. "We have 3 types of black dye," stated the dyer. "Our cheapest grade uses chromium, alum, and red argol, logwood, and barwood. This produces a good black, though not very durable. The color will fade with washing. The next grade dye utilizes camwood and copperas and logwood. This grade is better than the first I named, though the black can turn slightly green over a long period of time. The best grade is done with indigo and camwood. This provides a deep, rich black that will not fade no matter how many times the cloth is washed. The latter is, of course, the most expensive." "How much?" Raistlin asked. The dyer named a price, and Raistlin winced. It would considerably diminish the number of coins and the small leather pouch he had hidden in a conjured cubbyhole in the monk's cell he was occupying in the great library. He should settle for the less costly dye, but then he thought of appearing before the wealthy, powerful black robes of Neraka, and he cringed as he imagined walking among them in black robes that were not black but slightly green. "The indigo," he stated, and he handed over his robes. "Very good, sir," said the dyer. "May I have your name?" "Bertram," Raistlin replied with a smile that he kept hidden in the shadow of the cowl. Bertram was the name of Astinus's long-suffering and harried chief assistant. The dyer made a note. "When may I return for these?" Raistlin asked. My friend is in a hurry." "Day after tomorrow," said the Dyer. "Not sooner?" Raistlin asked, disappointed. The Dyer shook his head. "Not unless your friend wants to walk the streets dripping black dye." Raistlin gave a curt nod and took his leave. The moment Raistlin's back was turned, the Dyer spoke a word to his assistant, then hurried out of the building. Raistlin saw the man hastening down the street, but exhausted from the long walk and half suffocated by the choking fumes, he paid no heed. The great library was located in the old city. The hour being high watch, when shops normally closed for lunch, more people thronged the streets. The noise was appalling, dinning in Raistlin's ears. The long walk had taxed Raistlin's strength to such an extent that he was forced to stop frequently to rest, and when he finally came in sight of the library's marble columns and imposing portico, he was so weak that he feared he could not make it across the street without collapsing. Raistlin sank down on a stone bench not far from the great library. Winter's long night was drawing to a close. The dawn of spring was near. The bright sun was warm. Raistlin closed his eyes. His head slumped forward onto his chest. He dozed in the sun. He was back on board the ship, holding the dragon orb and facing his brother and Tanis and the rest of his friends. "Using my magic, and the magic of the dragon orb, it is quite simple, though probably beyond your weak minds. I now have the power to harness the energy of my corporeal body and the energy of my spirit into one. I will become pure energy, light, if you want to think of it that way. And becoming light, I can travel through the heavens like the rays of the sun, returning to this physical world whenever and wherever I choose." "Can the orb do this for all of us?" Tanis asked. "I will not chance it. I know I can escape. The others are not my concern. You led them into this blood-red death, half-elf. You get them out. You won't harm your brother. Caramon, stop him!" "Tell him, Caramon. The last test in the Tower of High Sorcery was against myself, and I failed. I killed him. I killed my brother." "Aha! I thought I'd find you here, you doorknob of a candor." Raistlin stirred uneasily in his sleep. "That is Flint's voice, and that is all wrong," Raistlin thought. "Flint isn't here. I haven't seen Flint in a long time, not for months, not since the fall of Tarsus." Raistlin sank back into the dream. "Don't try to stop me, Tanis. I killed Caramon once, you see. Or rather, it was an illusion meant to teach me to fight against the darkness within, but they were too late. I had already given myself to the darkness." "I tell you, I saw him." Raistlin woke with a start. He knew that voice as well. Tasselhoff barefoot stood quite close to him. Raistlin had only to rise up from the bench and walk a few paces, and he could reach out his hand and touch him. Flint Fireforge was standing beside the candor, and though they both had their backs to Raistlin, he could picture the exasperated look on the old dwarf's face as he tried arguing with the candor. Raistlin had seen the quivering beard and flushed cheeks often enough. "It can't be," Raistlin told himself, shaken. "Tasselhoff was in my mind, and now I have conjured him up whole." But just to be safe, Raistlin pulled down the cowl of the grey robe, making sure it covered his face, and he thrust his gold-skinned hands inside the sleeves of his robes. The candor looked like Tas from the back, but then all Candor looked alike, either from the front or the back, short in stature, dressed in the brightest clothing they could find, their long hair done up in outlandish topknots, their small, slender bodies festooned in pouches. The dwarf looked the same as any dwarf, short and stocky, clad in armor, wearing a helm decorated with horsehair, or the mane of a griffin. "I saw Raistlin, I tell you," the Candor was saying insistently. He pointed to the great library. "He was lying on those very stairs. The monks were all gathered around him. That staff of his, the staff of maggots." "Mages," the dwarf muttered. "Was on the stairs beside him." "So what if it was Raistlin?" the dwarf demanded. "I think he was dying, Flint," said the Candor solemnly. Raistlin shut his eyes. There was no longer any doubt. Tasselhoff, Burfoot, and Flint Fireforge, his old friends, the two, had watched him grow up, him and Caramon. Raistlin had wondered frequently if they were still alive, Flint and Tass and Sturm. They had been parted in the attack on Tarsus. He now wondered, astonished, how they had come to be in Panathus. What adventures had brought them to that place? He was curious, and he was surprisingly glad to see them. Drawing back his cowl, he rose from the bench with the intention of making himself known to them. He would ask about Sturm and about Lorna, the golden-haired Lorna. "If the sly one's dead, good riddance," Flint said grimly. "He made my skin crawl." Raistlin sat back down on the bench and pulled the cowl over his face. "You don't mean that," Tass began. "I do so mean it," Flint roared. "How do you know what I mean and I don't mean? I said so yesterday and I'll say it today. Raistlin was always looking down that gold nose of his at us, and he turned Caramon into his slave. Caramon make my tea. Caramon carry my pack. Caramon clean my boots. It's a good thing Raistlin never told his brother to jump off a cliff. Caramon would be lying at the bottom of a ravine by now." "I kind of liked Raistlin," said Tass. "He magicked me into a duck pond once. I know that sometimes he wasn't very nice, Flint, but he didn't feel good. What with that cough of his, and he didn't help you when you had the rheumatism." "I never had rheumatism a day in my life. Rheumatism is for old people," said Flint, glowering. "Now, where do you think you're going?" he demanded, seizing hold of Tasselhoff, who was about to cross the street. "I thought I'd go up to the library and knock on the door, and I would ask the monks, very politely, if Raistlin was there." "Wherever Raistlin is, you can be sure he's up to no good, and you can just put the thought of knocking on the library door out of your rattle-brained mind. You heard what they said yesterday. No candor allowed." "I figured I'd ask them about that too," Tass said. "Why won't they allow candor into the library?" "Because there wouldn't be a book left on the shelves, that's why. You'd rob them blind." "We don't rob people," Tasselhoff said indignantly. "Candor are very honest, and I think that's a disgrace. Candor not being allowed. I'll just go give them a piece of my mind." He twisted out of Flint's grasp and started to run across the street. Flint glared after him. Then, with a sudden gleam in his eye, he called out, "You can go if you want to, but you might want to listen to what I came to tell you. Lorna sent me. She said something about you riding a dragon." Tasselhoff turned around so fast that he tripped himself and tumbled over his own feet, sprawling flat on his face on the street and spilling half the contents of his pouches. "Me, Tasselhoff Burfoot? Ride a dragon? Oh, Flint!" Tasselhoff picked up himself and his pouches. "Isn't it wonderful?" "No," Flint said glumly. "Hurry up," Tasselhoff said, tugging on Flint's shirt. We don't want to miss the battle."
"It's not happening right this minute," Flint said, batting away the Kender's hands. "You go on, I'll be along."
Tas didn't wait to be told twice. He dashed off down the street, pausing at intervals to tell everyone he met that he, Tasselhoff Barefoot, was going to be riding a dragon with a golden general. Flint stood long moments after the Kender had left, staring at the great library. The old dwarf's face grew grave and solemn. He was about to cross the street, but then he paused. His heavy grey brows came together. He thrust his hands in his pockets and shook his head.
"Good riddance,"
he muttered, and he turned and followed Tas. Raistlin remained sitting on the bench a long time after they had gone. He sat there until the sun had gone down behind the buildings of Palanthas, and the night air of early spring grew chill. At last he rose. He did not go to the library. He walked the streets of Palanthas. Even though it was night, the streets were still crowded. The Lord of Palanthas had come out to publicly reassure his people. The silver dragons were on their side. The dragons had promised to protect them, the Lord said. He declared a time for celebration. People lit bonfires and began dancing in the streets. Raistlin found the noise and the gaiety jarring. He shoved his way through the drunken throng, heading for a part of the city where the streets were deserted, the buildings dark and abandoned. No one lived in that part of the great city. No one ever went there. Raistlin had never been there, but he knew the way well. He turned a corner. At the end of the empty street, surrounded by a ghastly forest of death, rose a tower of black silhouetted against a blood-red sky. The Tower of High Sorcery of Palanthas. The accursed tower. Blackened and broken, the crumbling building had been vacant for centuries. "None shall enter save the master of past and present." Raistlin took a step toward the tower, then stopped. "Not yet," he murmured. "Not yet." He felt a cold and corpse-like hand brush his cheek, and he flinched away.
"Only one of us young mages," said Fistandantilus. "Only one can be the master."
Chapter 2. The Last of the Wine, 2nd day month of Mishamont, year 352 AC. The gods of magic, solinary, lunitary, and nuitary were cousins. Their parents formed the triumvirate of gods who ruled Kryn. Solinary was a son of Paladine and Meshakel, gods of light. Lunitary, the daughter of Gelene, god of the book. Nuitary was the son of Takisis, queen of darkness. From the day of their birth, the cousins had formed a strong alliance, bound together by their dedication to magic. Eons earlier, the three cousins gave to mortals the ability to be able to control and manipulate arcane energy. True to form, mortals abused their gift. Magic ran amok in the world, causing terrible destruction and loss of life. The cousins realized that they must establish laws governing the use of the power, and thus they created the Orders of High Sorcery. Ruled by a conclave of wizards, the order established laws regarding the use of the magic that strictly controlled those who practiced a powerful art. The Tower of High Sorcery in Weirith was the last of the 5 original centers of magic on Ansalon. The other 3 towers, those located in the cities of Daltegoth, Losarkum, and Ishtar, had been destroyed. The Tower of Palanthas still existed, but it was cursed. only the Tower of Weirith, located in the wayward and mysterious forest of Weirith, remained active and very much alive. Since people tend to fear what they do not understand, wizards trying to live among ordinary folk often found life difficult. No matter whether they served the god of the silver moon, Solinary, or the god of the dark moon, Nuitary, or the goddess of the red moon, Lunitary, wizards were generally reviled and mistrusted. Small wonder that mages liked to spend as much time as possible in the Tower of Weirith. There, among their own kind, they could be themselves, study their art, practice new spells, purchase or exchange magical artifacts, and enjoy being in the company of those who spoke the language of magic. Before the return of Takhisis, wizards of all three orders had lived and worked together in the Tower of Weirith. Black robes had rubbed elbows with white robes, waging debates related to magic. If a spell component required the use of cobweb, was it better to use cobwebs spun by spiders in the wild, or those raised in captivity? Because cats pursued their own secret agendas, did they make untrustworthy familiars? When Queen Takhisis declared war upon the world, her son Nuitary broke ranks with his cousins for the first time since the creation of magic. Nuitary loathed his mother. He suspected her flatteries and promises were lies, yet he wanted to believe. He joined the ranks of the Dark Queen's army, and he took many of his black robes with him. The wizards of Ansalon continued to present a united front to the world, but in truth, the orders were being torn apart. The wizards were ruled by a governing body known as a conclave, which was made up of an equal number of wizards from each order. The head of the conclave during such turbulent times was a white-robed wizard named Parsalian. In his early 60s, Parsalian was deemed by most to be a strong leader, just and wise, but given the rising disorder among the ranks of wizards, there were those who began to say that he had lost control, that he was not fit for the job. Parsalian sat alone in his study in the Tower of High Sorcery at Weirith. The night was cold, and a small fire burned in the grate, a real fire, not a magical one. Parsalian did not believe in using magic for the sake of convenience. He read by candlelight, not magical light. He swept his floor with a plain, ordinary broom. He required everyone living and working in the tower to do the same. The candle burned out, and the fire dwindled, leaving Parsalian in darkness, save for the glow of the dying embers. He gave up trying to study his spells. That required concentration, and he could not concentrate his mind upon memorizing the arcane words. Ansalon was in turmoil. The forces of the Dark Queen were perilously close to winning the war. There were some glimmerings of hope. The meeting of the Whitestone Council had brought together elves, dwarves, and humans. The three races had agreed to set aside their differences and unite against the foe. The Blue Lady, Dragon High Lord Kitiara, and her forces had been defeated at the High Clerist's Tower. Clerics of Paladine and Mishakol had brought hope and healing to the world. Yet for all the good, the mighty force of the dragon armies and the terrifying threat of the evil dragons were arrayed against the forces of light. Even now, Parsalian waited in dread for the news that Palanthas had fallen. A knock came on the door. Parsalian sighed. He was certain it was the news he feared to hear. His assistant having long since gone to bed, Parsalian rose to answer the knock himself. He was astonished to find his visitor was Justarius, the head of the Order of the Red Robes.
"My friend, you are the last person I expected to see this night. Come in, please. Sit down."
Jasterius limped into the room. He was a tall man, strong and hale, except for his twisted leg. An athletic youth, he had been fond of participating in contests of physical skill, all that had ended with a test in the tower, which had left him permanently maimed. Jasterius never spoke of the test and never complained about his injury, other than to say, with a shrug and a half-smile, that he had been most fortunate. He might have died.
"I'm glad to see you safe," Parsalian continued, lighting candles and adding wood to the fire. "I thought you would be among those battling the dragon armies in Palanthas."
He paused in his work to look at his friend in dismay.
"Has the city already fallen?"
"Far from it," said Jasterius, seating himself before the blaze. He positioned his injured leg on a small footstool to keep it elevated and smiled. "Open a bottle of your finest elven wine, my friend, for we have something to celebrate."
"What is it? Tell me, quickly. My thoughts have been filled with darkness," said Parsalian.
"The good dragons have entered the war." Parsalian stared at his friend for long moments. Then he gave a great shuddering sigh.
"Praise be to Paladine, and to Gilleen, of course," he added quickly with a glance at Jasterius. "Tell me the details."
"Silver dragons arrived this morning to defend the city. The dragon armies did not launch their anticipated attack. Lorena of the Qualinesti Elves was named Golden General and made leader of the forces of light, including the Knights of Solamnia."
"This calls for something special."
Parsalian poured wine for them both.
"My last bottle of Sylvanesti wine. Alas, there will be no more elven wine from that sad land for a long time, I fear."
He resumed his seat.
"And so they have chosen the daughter of the elf king of Qualinesti to be Golden General. The choice is a wise one."
"A political one," said Jasterius wryly. "The knights could not settle on a leader of their own. The defeat of the dragon armies at the High Clerist's Tower is due in large part to Lorena's courage and valor and quick thinking. She had the power to inspire men with both words and deeds. The knights who fought at the tower admire and trust her. In addition, she will bring the elves into the battle." The two wizards lifted their glasses and drank to the success of the Golden General and to the good dragons, as they were popularly known. Jasterius replaced a silver goblet on a nearby table and rubbed his eyes. His face was haggard. He settled back into his chair with a sigh.
"Are you well?"
Parsalian asked with concern. "I have not slept in many nights," Jasterius replied, "and I travelled the corridors of magic to come here. Such a journey is always wearing."
"Did the Lord of Palanthas ask for your help in defending the city?"
Parsalian was astonished.
"No, of course not,"
said Jasterius with some bitterness. "I was prepared to do my part, however. I have my home, my family to protect, as well as my city, which I love." He lifted his goblet again, but he did not drink. He stared morosely in the dark. Plum-colored wine.
"Come, out with it," said Parsalian grimly. "I hope your bad news does not offset the good."
Jasterius gave a heavy sigh. "You and I have often wondered why the good dragons refused to heed our pleas for help. Why they did not enter the war when Takhisis sent her evil dragons to burn cities and slaughter innocents. Now I know the answer.
and it is a terrible one." He was silent again. Par-Salian took a drink of his wine as though to brace himself. "A silver dragon who calls herself Silvara made the horrible discovery," Jasla said. "It seems that years ago, sometime around 287 AC, Takhisis ordered the evil dragons to secretly creep into the lairs of the good dragons as they slept the long sleep, and steal their eggs. Once their young were in her possession, Takhisis awakened the good dragons to tell them that she intended to launch a war upon the world. If the good dragons intervened, Takhisis threatened to destroy their eggs. Afraid for their young, the good dragons took an oath, promising that they would not fight her. "And that oath is now broken," said Par-Salian. "The good dragons discovered that Takhisis had broken her oath first," Jasla replied. "The Weis have speculated as to the origin of the so-called lizard men, the Draconians." Par-Salian stared at his friend in horror. "You don't mean to tell me?" He clenched his fist. "That is not possible." "It is, I'm afraid. Silvara and a friend, an elf warrior named Gilthanas, discovered the terrible truth. Through the use of dark and unholy magic, the eggs of the metallic dragons were perverted, changed from dragons into the creatures we know as Draconians. Silvara and Gilthanas attest to this. They witnessed the ceremony. They barely escaped with their lives." Par-Salian was stricken. "A terrible loss, a tragic loss. Beauty and wisdom and nobility transformed into hideous monstrosities." He fell silent. Both men knew the question that must be asked next. Both knew the answer. Neither wanted to speak it aloud. Par-Salian was the master of the conclave, however. The discovery of the truth, however unpleasant, was his responsibility. "I notice you said that the eggs were perverted through the use of unholy magic and dark magic. Are you saying that one of our order performed this monstrous act?" "I'm afraid so," Jasla said quietly. "A black-robed named Dracart, in conjunction with a cleric of Takhisis, and a red dragon devised the spells. You must take swift action, Par-Salian. That is why I came here in all haste tonight. You must dissolve the conclave, denounce the black robes, cast them out of the tower, and forbid them from ever coming here again." Par-Salian said nothing. His right fist unclenched, clenched again. He stared into the fire. "We are already suspect in the eyes of the world," Jasla said. "If people find out that a wizard was complicit with this heinous act, they would rise against us. This could well destroy us." Still Par-Salian was silent. "Sir," said Jasla, his voice hardening, "the god Nuitari was involved in this. He had to be. He sided with his mother Takhisis years ago, which means that as head of the Black Robes, LaDonna must be involved as well." "You don't know that for certain," said Par-Salian sternly. "You have no proof." He and LaDonna had been lovers back in the past, back in their youth, back in the days when passion overthrows reason. Jasla was aware of their history, and he was careful not to mention it, but Par-Salian knew his friend was thinking it. "None of us have seen LaDonna or her followers for over a year," Jasla continued. "Our gods, Solinary and Lunitary, have made no secret of the fact that they were dismayed and angered when Nuitari broke with them to serve his mother. We must face facts, sir. The three cousins are estranged. Our sacred brotherhood of wizards, the ties that bind us, white, black, and red, are severed. Already LaDonna in her black robes may be poised to launch an assault against the tower. "No!" Parsalian said, slamming his fist on the arm of the chair, spilling the wine. Parsalian, with his long white beard and quiet demeanour, was sometimes taken for a weak and benign old man, even by those who knew him best. The head of the conclave had not attained his high position through lack of fire in his blood and belly, however. The heat of that fire could be astonishing. "I will not dissolve the conclave. I do not for one moment believe that LaDonna was involved in this crime, nor do I blame Nuitari." Justerius frowned. A black robe. Dracard was seen in the act. "What of it?" Parsalian glowered at his friend. "He may have been a renegade." "He was," said a voice. Justerius twisted around in his chair. When he saw who had spoken, he cast an accusing glance at Parsalian. "I didn't know you had company," Justerius said coldly. "I didn't know myself," said Parsalian. "You should have made yourself known, LaDonna. It is rude to eavesdrop, especially on friends." "I had to make certain you were still my friends," she said. A human woman in her middle years, LaDonna scorned to try to conceal her age, as did some, using the artifices of nature and magic to bring plump youth to wrinkled cheeks. She wore her long, thick grey hair as proudly as a queen wears a crown, coiffing her hair in elaborate styles. Her black robes were generally made of the finest velvet, soft and sumptuous, and decorated with runes stitched in gold and silver thread. But when she emerged from the shadowed corner where she had been secretly watching, the two men were shocked by the change in her appearance. LaDonna was haggard, pale, and seemed to have aged years. Her long grey hair straggled out from two hastily plaited braids that hung down her back. Her elegant black robes were dirty and bedraggled, tattered and frayed. She looked exhausted, almost to the point of collapsing. Parsalian hurriedly brought forth a chair and poured her a goblet of wine. She drank it gratefully. Her dark eyes went to Justerius. "You are very quick to judge me, sir," she said acidly. "The last time I saw you, madam," he returned in kind, "you were loudly proclaiming devotion to Queen Tachisis. Are we to believe you did not commit this crime?" LaDonna took a sip of the wine, then said quietly, "If being a fool is a crime, then I'm guilty as charged." She raised her eyes, casting both men a flashing glance. "But I swear to you that I had nothing to do with the corruption of the dragon eggs. I did not know of this despicable act until only a short time ago. And when I found out, I did what I could to make amends. You can ask Silvara and Gilthanas. They would not be alive now if it were not for my help and the help of Nuitari." Justerius remained very grim. Parsalian regarded her with grave solemnity. LaDonna rose to her feet and raised her hand to her heaven. "I call upon Solinary, god of the silver moon. I call upon Lunitary, goddess of the red moon. I call upon Nuitari, god of the dark moon. Witness my oath. I swear by the magic we hold sacred, I am speaking the truth. Withdraw your blessing from me, all the gods, if I am lying. Let the words of magic slip from my mind. Let my spell components turn to dust. Let my scrolls burn. Let my hand be stricken from my wrist." She waited a moment, then resumed her seat. "It is cold in here,"
she said, staring hard at Jasterius. "Should I build up the fire?" She pointed her hand at the fireplace where the fire was dying and spoke a word of magic. Flames danced on the iron grate. The fire grew so hot the three had to draw back their chairs. LaDonna lifted her goblet and took a gulp. "Nuitari has broken with Takhisis," Parcelian asked in astonishment. "He was seduced by sweet words and lavish promises, as was I," LaDonna said bitterly. "The Queen's sweet words were lies, her promises false." "What did you expect?" Jasterius asked with a sneer. "The Dark Queen has thwarted your ambition and hurt your pride. So now you come crawling back to us. I suppose you're in danger. You know the Queen's secrets. Has she set the hounds upon you? Is that why you've come to Wereth to hide behind our robes?" "I did discover her secrets," LaDonna said softly. She sat for long moments, staring at her hands. Her fingers were long and supple still, though the skin was reddened and drawn tightly over the fine bones. "And yes, I am in danger. We are all in danger. That is why I have come back. Risked my life to come back to warn you." Parcelian exchanged alarmed glances with Jasterius. Both men had known LaDonna for many years. They had seen her in the magnificence of her power. They had seen her raging in anger. One of them had seen her soft and tender with love. LaDonna was a fighter. She had battled her way to the top of the ranks of the Black Robes by defeating and sometimes slaying in magical combat those who challenged her. She was courageous, a formidable foe. Neither man had ever seen the strong and powerful woman show weakness. Neither had ever seen her as they saw her at that moment, shaken, afraid. "There is a building in Neraka called the Red Mansion. Ariacus sometimes lived there. When he returns to Neraka, in this mansion is a shrine to Takhisis. The shrine is not as grand as the one in her temple. It is far more secret and private, open only to Ariacus and his favorites, such as Kitiara and my former pupil, and his mistress, the wizardess Iolanthe. To make a long story short, several of my colleagues were most horribly murdered. I feared I was next. I went to the shrine to talk to Queen Takhisis directly." Jasterius muttered something. "I know," said LaDonna. Her hand shook, spilling the wine. "I know. But I was alone, and I was desperate." Parcelian reached over and laid his hand on her hand. She smiled tremulously and clasped her fingers over his. He was startled and shocked to see tears glimmer in her eyes. He had never before seen her cry. "I was about to enter the shrine when I realized that someone was already there. It was High Lord Kitiara, talking to Ariacus. I used my magic to make myself invisible and listened to their conversation. You have heard of the Dark Queen's search for a man called Berem? He is known as the Everman, or the Green Gemstone Man. The dragon armies are all taxed with finding this man. We have been trying to discover why," said Parcelian. "What makes him so important to Takhisis?" "I can tell you," said LaDonna. "If Takhisis finds Berem, she will be victorious. She will enter the world in all her might and power. No one, not even the gods, will be able to withstand her." She related the Everman's tragic story to her audience. The two men listened in astonishment and grief to the tale of Jasla and Berem, a tale of murder and forgiveness, hope and redemption. Parcelian and Jasterius were silent, each turning over what he heard in his mind. LaDonna slumped in her chair and closed her eyes. Parsalian offered to pour her another glass of wine. "Thank you, my dear friend, but if I drink any more, I will fall asleep where I sit. Well, what do you think?"
"I think we must act," said Parsalian. "I would like to do some investigating on my own," said Justeris crisply. "Madame LaDonna will forgive me when I say that I do not entirely trust her."
"Investigate all you like," said LaDonna. "You will find that I've spoken the truth. I'm too exhausted to lie. And now, if you'll excuse me." As she rose, she staggered with weariness and had to put her hand on the arm of the chair to steady herself. "I cannot travel this night. If I could have a blanket in the corner of some novice's cell—"
"Nonsense," said Parsalian. "You will sleep in your chamber as usual. Everything is as it was when you left. Nothing was moved or altered. You will even find a fire in the grate."
LaDonna lowered her proud head, then extended her hand to Parsalian. "My old friend, thank you. I made a mistake. I admit it freely. If it is any consolation, I have paid dearly for it." Justeris rose with some difficulty, leveraging himself up out of the chair. Sitting for any length of time caused his crippled leg to stiffen.
"Will you also spend the night with us, my friend?" Parsalian asked.
Justeris shook his head.
"I'm needed back in Palanthas. I bring more news. If you could wait one moment, madam, this will be of interest to you. On the 26th day of Ranmont, Raistlin Majere was found half dead on the steps of the great library. One of my pupils happened to be passing and witnessed the incident. My pupil did not know who the man was, only that he was a wizard who wore the red robes of my order. That said, I do not think Raistlin will be of my order much longer," Justeris added. "Today one of the local cloth dyers brought me word that a young man came to his establishment with a request to dye red robes black. It seems your sword has a flaw in it, my friend."
Parsalian looked deeply troubled.
"You are certain it was Raistlin Majere?" "The young man gave a false name, but there cannot be many men in this world with golden-tinged skin and eyes with pupils like Hourglass. But to make sure, I spoke to Astenus. He assures me the young man is Raistlin. He is taking the black robes, and he's doing so without bothering to consult the conclave, as is required."
"He's turning renegade," LaDonna shrugged. "You have lost him, Parsalian. It seems I am not the only one to make mistakes."
"I never like to say I told you so," said Justeris grimly. "But I told you so." LaDonna left for her chambers. Justeris returned to Palanthas via the corridors of magic. Parsalian was alone again. He resumed his seat in his chair by the dying fire, pondering all he had heard. He tried to concentrate on the dire news LaDonna had brought, but he found his thoughts straying to Raistlin Majere. "Perhaps I did make a mistake when I chose him to be my sword to fight evil," Parsalian mused. "But given what I have heard this night, and what I know about Raistlin Majere, perhaps I did not."
Parsalian drank the last of the elven wine, then tossing the lees onto the glowing embers, dousing them, he went to his bed. Chapter 3 Memories. An Old Friend. Third day, month of Mishamont, year 352 AC. It wasn't the physical pain that clouded my mind. It was the old inner pain clawing at me, tearing at me with poisoned talons.
Caramon strong and cheerful, good and kind, open and honest. Caramon everyone's friend. Not like Raistlin, the runt, the sly one. All I ever had was my magic, I said, speaking clearly, thinking clearly for the first time in my life. And now you have that too. Using the wall for support, I raised both my hands, put my thumbs together. I began speaking the words that would summon the magic. Raist! Caramon started to back away. Raist, what are you doing? Come on, you need me. I'll take care of you, just like always, Raist. I'm your brother. I have no brother. Beneath the layer of cold, hard rock, jealousy bubbled and seethed. Tremors split the rock. Jealousy, red and molten, coursed through my body and flared out of my hands. The fire flared, billowed and engulfed Caramon. A knocking on the door brought Raistlin back abruptly to reality. He stirred in his chair and let go of the memory slowly and reluctantly, not because he enjoyed reliving that moment in time, far from it. The memory of his test in the Tower of High Sorcery was horrible, for it brought back the bitter pangs of jealous fury, the sight of Caramon being burned to death, the sound of his twins' screams, the stench of charred flesh. Then after that, having to face Caramon, who had been witness to his own death at his brother's hands, to see the pain in his eyes, far worse in some ways than the pain of dying, for it had been all illusion, a part of the test to teach Raistlin to know himself. He would not have brought it all back to mind, would have kept the memory locked away, but he was trying to learn something from it, so he had to endure it. The time was early morning, and he was in the small cell that he'd been given in the great library. The monks had carried him to the cell when they had thought he was dying. In the cell, he had at last dared to look into the darkness of his own soul and dared to meet the eyes that stared back at him. He had remembered the test, remembered the bargain he'd made with Fistandantilus in order to pass it. I said I was not to be bothered, Raistlin called out annoyed. Bothered? I'll bother him, a deep voice grumbled. I'll give him a good smack up the side of his head. You have a visitor, Master Majere, called out Bertram in apologetic tones. He says he's an old friend of yours. He's concerned about your health. Of course he is, Raistlin said sourly. He'd been expecting the visit, ever since he'd watched Flint start across the street to the library, only to change his mind. Flint would have spent the night brooding, but he would finally come, not with Tass. He would come alone. Tell him to go away. Tell him you're busy. You have a great deal of work to do to prepare for your journey to Neraka. But even as Raistlin was thinking these things, he was removing the magical spell that kept the door locked. He may enter, Raistlin said. Bertram, his bald head glistening with sweat, cautiously shoved open the door and peered inside. At the sight of Raistlin sitting in the chair, wearing grey robes, Bertram's eyes widened. But those are... Raistlin glared at him. Say what you came to say and be gone. A visitor, Bertram repeated faintly, then hastened off, his sandals flapping on the stone floor. Flint thumped inside. The old dwarf stood glowering at Raistlin from beneath his shaggy grey eyebrows. He crossed his arms over his chest beneath his long flowing beard. He was wearing the studded leather armor the dwarf preferred over steel. The armor was new and was embossed with a rose, the symbol of the Solamnic Nights. Flint wore the same helm as always.
He'd found the helm during one of their early adventures. Raistlin could not remember where. The helm was decorated with a tail made of horsehair. Flint always held it that it was the mane of a griffin, and nothing would disabuse him of that notion, not even the fact that griffins did not have manes. Only a few months had passed since they had last seen each other, but Raistlin was shocked at the change in the dwarf. Flint had lost weight. His skin had a chalky tinge to it. His breathing was labored, and his face was marred by new lines of sorrow and loss, weariness and worry. The old dwarf's eyes, glaring at Raistlin, flared with the same gruff spirit. Neither spoke. Flint harumphed, clearing his throat as he cast sharp, swift glances around the cell, taking in the spellbooks lying on the desk, the staff of mages standing in the corner, the empty cup that had held his tea. All Raistlin's possessions, nothing of Caramon. Flint frowned and scratched his nose, glancing from beneath lowered brows at Raistlin and shifting uncomfortably. How much more uncomfortable he would be if he knew the truth. Raistlin thought that I left Caramon and Tanis and the others to die. He wished Flint had not come. "The Kandor said he saw you," Flint said, breaking the silence at last. "He said you were dying." "As you see, I am very much alive," Raistlin said. "Yes, well," Flint stroked his beard. "You're wearing grey robes. What is that supposed to mean?" "That I sent my red ones to be washed," Raistlin said, adding caustically, "I am not so wealthy that I can afford an extensive wardrobe." He made an impatient gesture. "Did you come here to stare at me and comment on my clothes, or did you have some purpose?" "I came because I was worried about you," Flint said, frowning. Raistlin gave a sardonic smile. "You did not come because you were worried about me. You came because you were worried about Tanis and Caramon." "Well, and I have a right to be, don't I? What has become of them?" Flint demanded, his face flushing, bringing some color into his grey cheeks. Raistlin did not immediately respond. He could tell the truth. There was no reason he shouldn't. After all, he didn't give a damn what Flint thought of him, what any of them thought of him. He could tell the truth that he had left them to die in the maelstrom, but Flint would be outraged. He might even attack Raistlin in his fury. The old dwarf was no threat, but Raistlin would be forced to defend himself. Flint could get hurt, and there would be a scene. The aesthetics would be in an uproar. They would throw him out, and he was not ready to leave. "Lauren and Tass and I know you and the others escaped Tarsus," Flint said. "We shared the dream." He looked extremely uncomfortable at admitting that. Raistlin was intrigued. "The dream? In the nightmare land of Silvernesti? King Loric's dream? Did you? How very interesting." He thought back, considering how that might be possible. "I knew that the rest of us shared it, but that was because we were in the dream. I wonder how the rest of you came to experience it." "Gilthanas said it was a star jewel, the one Alana gave Sturm in Tarsus." "Alana said something about that, yes. It could be a star jewel. They are powerful magical artifacts. Does Sturm still have it?" "It was buried with him," said Flint gruffly. "Sturm's dead. He was killed at the battle of the High Clearest Tower." "I'm sorry to hear that," Raistlin said, and he was surprised to realize he truly was. "Sturm died a hero," said Flint. "He fought a blue dragon alone." "Then he died a fool," Raistlin remarked. Flint's face flushed. "What about Caramon? Why isn't he here?
He would never leave you. He'd die first."
"He may be dead now," said Raistlin. "Perhaps they all are. I do not know."
"Did you kill him?"
Flint asked, his flush deepening. "Yes, I killed him," Raistlin thought. He was engulfed in flames. Instead he said, "The door is behind you. Please shut it on your way out." Flint tried to speak, but he could only sputter with rage. Finally he managed to blurt out,
"I don't know why I came. I said good riddance when I heard you were dying. And I say good riddance now."
He turned on his heel and stomped angrily across the floor. He had reached the door and flung it open and was about to walk out when Raistlin spoke. "You're having problems with your heart," Raistlin said, talking to Flint's back. "You're not well. You're experiencing pain, dizziness, shortness of breath. You tire easily. Am I right?" Flint stopped where he stood in the doorway to the small cell, his hand on the handle. "If you do not take it easy," Raistlin continued, "your heart will burst." Flint glanced around over his shoulder.
"How long do I have?"
"Death could come at any moment," Raistlin said. "You must rest."
"Rest? There's a war on,"
Flint said loudly. Then he coughed and wheezed and pressed his hand to chest. Seeing Raistlin watching him, he muttered,
"We can't all die heroes,"
and stumped off, forgetting as he left to shut the door. Raistlin, sighing, rose to his feet and shut it for him. Caramon screamed, tried to beat out the flames, but there was no escaping the magic. His body withered, dwindled in the fire, became the body of a wizened old man, an old man wearing black robes, whose hair and beard were trailing wisps of fire. Fistandantilus, his hand outstretched, walked toward me.
"If your armor is dross,"
said the old man softly, "I will find the crack." I could not move, could not defend myself. The magic had sapped the last of my strength. Fistandantilus stood before me. The old man's black robes were tattered shreds of night. His flesh was rotting and decayed. The bones were visible through the skin. His nails were long and pointed, as long as those of a corpse. His eyes gleamed with a radiant heat that had been in my soul, the warmth that had brought the dead to life. A bloodstone hung from a pendant around the fleshless neck. The old man's hand touched my breast, caressed my flesh, teasing and tormenting. Fistandantilus plunged his hand into my chest and seized hold of my heart. As the dying soldier clasped his hands around the haft of the spear that has torn through his body, I seized hold of the old man's wrist, clamped my fingers in a grip that death would not have relaxed. Caught, trapped, Fistandantilus fought to break my grip, but he could not free himself and retain his hold on my heart. The white light of Solinary, the red light of Lunitary, and the black, empty light of Nuitary, light that I could see, merged in my fainting vision, stared down at me, an unwinking eye. "You may take my life," I said, keeping fast hold of the old man's wrist, as Fistandantilus kept hold of my heart. "But you will serve me in return." The eye winked and blinked out. Raistlin removed a soft leather pouch from the belt he wore around his waist. He reached his hand into the pouch and drew out what appeared to be a small bowl made of colored glass, very like a child's marble. He rolled the glass bowl around in the palm of his hand, watching the colors writhe and swirl inside. "You grow to be a nuisance, old man," Raistlin said softly,
and he didn't give a damn if Fistandantilus heard him or not. He had a plan, and there was nothing the undead wizard could do to stop him. Chapter 4. The Cursed Tower, the Dragon Orb, Silence, 4th day, month of Mishamont, year 352 AC. The new black robes were still slightly damp around the seams, and they smelled faintly of almond. The scent came from the indigo, the dyer told him. Raistlin was also convinced he could detect the odor of urine, which was used to set the dye, despite the dyer's assurance that the robes had been rinsed a great many times, and that the smell was all in his imagination. The dyer offered to keep the robes and rinse them again, but Raistlin could not afford to take the time. His biggest fear was that the Dark Queen would win her war before he had a chance to join her, impress her with his skill, and acquire her help in furthering his career. He pictured in his mind becoming a leader among the black robes of the Tower of High Sorcery in Neraka, her capital city. He pictured the tower itself. It must be magnificent. He supposed the wizard Ladonna lived there, if she were still head of the Order of the Black. He grimaced at the thought of having to abase himself before the old crone, treat her as his superior. He'd have to explain why he had taken the black robes without seeking her permission. Ah, well, his servitude would not last long. With the support of the Dark Queen, Raistlin would be able to rise above them all. He would have no more need of them. His ambitious dreams would be fulfilled. "Your dreams!" Fistandantilus snarled, his voice pounding like blood in Raistlin's ears. "Your dreams are my dreams. I spent a lifetime, many lifetimes, working toward my goal, becoming the master of past and present. No sniveling, hacking upstart will steal it." Raistlin kept his own thoughts in check, refusing to be drawn into battle before he was ready. He walked rapidly, unerringly through the night toward his destination, toward his destiny. The staff of mages lit his way, the orb held in the dragon's claw shining softly, illuminating the dark streets that, in this part of the city, were very dark and very empty. No lights shone in the windows, most of which were broken. No laughter rang from within the tumble-down buildings. The streets were deserted. No one, not even the fearless Candor, dared venture into the shadow of the Tower of High Sorcery, not by day, and especially not by night. The Tower of High Sorcery in Palanthas had once been the most beautiful of all the towers of high sorcery. Named the Lore Spire, the tower was to be dedicated to the search of wisdom and knowledge. The tower graced Palanthas, its wizards assisting the knights to fight Queen Tachisis in the Third Dragon War. The wizards of all three orders came together to create the fabled dragon orbs and use them to lure the evil dragons into a trap. Tachisis was driven into the abyss, and the White Tower of the Wizards and the High Clerist's Tower of the Knights were both proud guardians of Solamnia. Then came the rise of the king-priests, who dictated that sorcery was evil. The knights were strong supporters of the king-priests, and they came to view the wizards with distrust and finally demanded that the wizards abandon the tower. 2 towers of high sorcery had already been attacked, and the wizards had destroyed them, with devastating results to the populaces of those cities. The wizards of Palanthas decided to surrender their tower. The Lord of Palanthas had intended to take over the tower for his own use, as a king-priest had taken over the Tower of Istar. But before the Lord could turn the key in the lock, a black-robed wizard named Andros Ranok cast a curse upon it. The crowd who had gathered to rejoice in the eviction of the wizards watched in horror as Ranok cried out, "The gates will remain closed and the halls empty until the day comes when the Master of Past and Present returns with power." Then he had leaped from the tower and was impaled upon the barbs of the fence. As his blood flowed over the iron, he spoke a curse with his dying breath. The beautiful tower was transformed into a thing of evil, horrible to look upon. Almost 400 years had passed, and no one had dared come too near it. Many had tried, but few could summon up the courage to come within sight of the dread Shoiken Grove, a forest of oak trees that stood guard around the tower. No one knew what went on in the grove. No one who entered the grove ever returned to tell. Raistlin was here in this part of Palanthas because he had magic to perform, and it was vital that he be left alone. Any interruption, such as Bertrand knocking on his door, might well be fatal. The tower's twisted remains came into view, blotting out the stars, blotting out the light of the two moons, Solinary and Lunitary. Nuitary the dark moon was still visible, though only to the eyes of those who had been initiated into the dark god's secrets. Raistlin kept his eyes upon the dark moon and drew courage from it. He pressed steadily on, even though he could feel the terror that flowed in a bone-chilling river from the tower. Fear lapped at his feet. He shivered and drew his robes closer around him and went on. Fear grew deeper. He began to sweat. His hands trembled. His breath came fast, and he was afraid he would have a coughing fit. He gripped the staff of Mages tightly, and though the shadow of the tower snuffed out every other light in the world, the staff's light did not fail him. The river of terror grew so deep that he could barely find the courage to put one foot in front of the other. Death awaited him. The next step would be his doom. Still, he took that next step. Gritting his teeth, he took another. "Turn back!" Fistandantilus urged him, his voice hammering inside Raistlin's brain. "You are mad to think of trying to destroy me. You need me." "You need me, Raist," Caramon's voice said, pleading. "I can protect you." "Shut up," Raistlin said, "both of you." He came within sight of the Shoiken Grove, and he shuddered and closed his eyes. He could not go on, not without risking dying of the terror. He was far from the populated part of the city. It would do. He searched around for a suitable place to cast his spell. Nearby was an empty building with 3 gables and leaded-pane windows. According to the sign that dangled at a crazy angle from a hook, the building had once been a tavern known as a Wizard's Hat, a name suitable for a tavern located near the Tower of High Sorcery of Palanthas. The painted sign was extremely faded, but by the light of the staff, Raistlin could see a laughing wizard quaffing ale from a pointed hat. Raistlin was reminded of the senile old wizard Fitzbin, who had worn, and continually mislaid, a hat that looked very much like the one portrayed on the sign. The memory of Fitzbin made Raistlin uncomfortable, and he quickly banished it. He walked over to the door and shoved on it. The door creaked on rusty hinges and swung slowly open. Raistlin was about to enter when he had the feeling he was being watched. He told himself that was nonsense. No one in his right mind came to this part of the city. Just to reassure himself, he cast a glance around the street. He saw no one, and he was about to enter the tavern when he happened to look up at the sign. The painted eyes of the wizard were fixed on him. As he stared, one eye winked. Raistlin shivered. The thought came to him that if he failed, he would die there and no one would ever know what had happened to him. His body would not be found. He would die and be forgotten, a pebble washed away in the river of time. Don't be an idiot, Raistlin chided himself. He stared hard at the sign. It was a trick of the light. He walked swiftly into the abandoned tavern and shut the door behind himself. All that time, Fistandantilus was berating him. I cast the curse of Rannoch. I am the master of past and present. You are nothing, a nobody. Without me, you would have failed your test in the tower. Without me, Raistlin returned, you would be lost and adrift in the vastness of the universe, a voice without a mouth, a scream no one can hear. You have used my knowledge, Fistandantilus said. I have fed you my power. I spoke the words that mastered the dragon orb, said Raistlin. I tell you the words to speak, Fistandantilus retorted. You do, Raistlin agreed, and all the while you mean to destroy me. You will wait until my life force gives you strength, and then you will use it to kill me. You plan to become me. I won't let that happen. Fistandantilus laughed. My hand holds your heart. We are bound together. If you kill me, you will die. I'm not convinced of that. Still, I will not take a chance, said Raistlin. I do not intend to kill you. He sat down upon a dust-covered bench. The tavern's interior was much as it had been centuries before, when the tavern had been a popular place for the wizards and their pupils to congregate. There was no bar, but there were tables surrounded by comfortable chairs. Raistlin would have expected the room to be filled with cobwebs and overrun by rats, but apparently even spiders and rodents were loath to live within the shadow of the tower, for the dust lay thick and smooth and undisturbed. A mural on the wall portrayed the three gods of magic toasting each with mugs of foaming ale. Raistlin looked around the empty tables and chairs, and he imagined wizards sitting there, laughing, telling tales, discussing their work. Raistlin saw himself seated there, discoursing, studying, arguing with his fellows. He would have been accepted for what he was, not reviled. He would have been loved, admired, respected. Instead, he was alone in the darkness with the spectre of evil. Raistlin leaned the staff of Mage's against the table, propping it with a chair so it would shed its pure white light on the table. A cloud of dust rose as he sat down, and he sneezed and coughed. When the coughing fit ended, he took the orb from its pouch and placed it on the table. Fistandantilus had gone quiet. Raistlin could no longer mask his thoughts from the old man, for he had to concentrate his entire being on taking control of the dragon orb. Fistandantilus saw the danger he was in, and he was trying to find a way to save himself. Raistlin placed the dragon orb on the table, steadying the small globe so it did not roll off onto the floor. He took from another pouch a crudely carved wooden stand he had constructed during those days when he and Caramon and the others had travelled by wagon across Ansalon. Raistlin had been happy then, happier than he had been in a long time. He and his brother had rediscovered some of their old camaraderie, remembering what it was like in their mercenary days when it had been just the two of them relying on steel and magic for their survival. He brushed dust from the table off the dragon orb and brushed the dust of Caramon from his mind. He placed the orb in the center of the wooden stand. The orb was cold to the touch. He could see in the staff's light the varied shades of green swirling around slowly inside. He knew what to expect, having used the orb before, and he waited, counseling patience, battling fear. He thought back to the writings of an elf wizard named Feothas, who had once possessed a dragon orb. Raistlin recalled one line. Every time you try to gain control of a dragon orb, the dragon inside is trying to gain control of you.